Just 10 minutes into our divorce trial, my lawyer husband laughed out loud in the middle of a packed courtroom. He looked the judge dead in the eye and demanded more than half of my $12 million fortune, including the sacred trust fund my late father left me. My own mother and sister sat right behind him, cheering him on. They thought they had finally broken me. They thought I was just the silent workhorse who would surrender everything to keep the peace. But then I reached into my briefcase, pulled out a sealed brown envelope, and handed it to the judge. I simply smiled and said, "Please take another look." The judge opened it, adjusted her glasses, and burst into a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the marble walls. Before I take you inside that courtroom, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the pain before delivering the ultimate revenge against the people who betrayed you. It was a humid Tuesday morning at the Fulton County Superior Court in Atlanta. The air conditioning was working overtime, but the tension in the room was suffocating. I sat at the defense table wearing a simple tailored charcoal suit, perfectly calm. Next to me sat my attorney Elias, a seasoned veteran who knew exactly how to play the long game. Across the aisle stood Julian, my soon-to-be ex-husband. Julian was a corporate lawyer, and he carried himself like a man who believed the law was written specifically for his benefit. He was wearing a custom $3,000 Navy suit, his posture radiating pure, unadulterated arrogance. He paced in front of his table, acting as if he was already delivering a victorious closing argument rather than just opening statements. We had been married for 5 years, and for 5 years I had played the supportive wife while building my financial technology company from the ground up. My app was designed to help low-income families secure microloans and build credit. I poured my blood, sweat, and tears into it, working 18-hour days while Julian complained that dinner was not hot when he got home. Just last month, my company was officially valued at $12 million. The moment that valuation went public, Julian filed for divorce. Now he stood before Judge Rosalind Mercer, a formidable woman known for her zero-tolerance policy toward courtroom theatrics. But Julian was too blinded by greed to read the room. His attorney, a flashy man who matched Julian perfectly in arrogance, cleared his throat and addressed the court. "Your Honor, my client is asking for a standard equitable division of marital assets. However, given the exceptional circumstances, we are demanding 50% of the defendant's financial technology company. Furthermore, we are claiming 50% of the late father's trust fund as marital property." He argued that my relentless dedication to my career constituted an abandonment of my marital duties. According to Julian, because I was busy securing venture capital instead of tending to his every need, he was entitled to compensation for his emotional distress. It was the ultimate insult. He wanted to strip away the legacy my father left me and claim half of the empire I built with my own 2 hands. The sheer audacity of his demands should have been the most painful part of the morning, but it was not. The real knife in my back was sitting in the gallery right behind Julian. My mother, Brenda, sat in the front row wearing her Sunday best, practically vibrating with anticipation. Next to her was my younger sister, Jasmine, the undisputed golden child of our family, wearing a designer dress she definitely could not afford on her own. And beside Jasmine sat her husband, Trent, a white man who ran a sham consulting business and never missed an opportunity to remind me of my place. They were not there to support me. They were there to watch my downfall. As Julian's lawyer listed off the millions they planned to take from me, Trent leaned forward and whispered loudly enough for the surrounding rows to hear. "It is about time somebody put her in her place. She has been acting way too proud lately." Jasmine snickered, hiding her mouth behind her manicured hand. She was already mentally spending my money, probably planning a luxury vacation to the Maldives. My mother, Brenda, did not even try to hide her satisfaction. She nodded along with every word Julian's lawyer said. For my entire life, I was the family scapegoat. I was the workhorse expected to carry the financial burdens, pay the medical bills, and fix every disaster Jasmine created. I was the strong, successful woman who was supposed to endure endless disrespect because that is just what family does. Brenda had always favored Julian because he catered to her vanity. When Julian started pushing for the divorce, Brenda instantly took his side, calculating that a wealthy, generous son-in-law was a better investment than a daughter she could no longer control. Watching my own flesh and blood cheer for the man trying to destroy me would have shattered a weaker woman. But I had finished crying over them months ago. Julian turned to look at me from across the aisle. He flashed a smug, triumphant smile, fully expecting me to break down. He expected me to beg for mercy or offer a massive settlement just to make the public humiliation stop. He thought my silence was the silence of a defeated woman. He had no idea it was the silence of a predator watching its prey step willingly into a trap. I did not shed a single tear. I did not glare at my mother or my sister. I simply adjusted my cuffs, keeping my breathing perfectly even. Then I reached down and popped the latches on my briefcase. My hands moved deliberately as I opened the briefcase. I did not rush. I let the metallic click of the latches echo in the quiet space between my table and the judge's bench. Inside, resting on top of my legal pads, was a thick, sealed brown envelope. It was heavy, containing over 100 pages of meticulously gathered financial records, corporate filings, and undeniable proof of my husband's arrogance. I picked it up, feeling the weight of my own salvation in my hands. Elias, my attorney, watched me with calm, steady eyes. He had been practicing family law in Atlanta for 30 years, and he had seen every dirty trick a greedy spouse could play. He had also been Julian's mentor once upon a time before Julian decided he was too smart for ethics and too important for loyalty. Elias knew exactly what was inside that envelope. We had spent countless late nights putting it together, tracing every lie and every hidden dollar. I handed the envelope to Elias without a single word. Elias stood up, smoothing the front of his modest suit. He did not have Julian's flash or his custom tailoring, but he had something much more dangerous. He had the truth. "Your Honor," Elias said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that instantly commanded the room. "The defense would like to submit supplementary evidence regarding the plaintiff's financial disclosure and his claims to my client's assets." Julian actually laughed. It was not a quiet chuckle, but an audible, dismissive sound that bounced off the wood-paneled walls. He leaned over to his attorney but spoke loud enough for the first few rows of the gallery to hear. "She is probably submitting fake therapy bills to gain sympathy. She always plays the victim when she does not get her way." In the gallery behind him, I heard my sister Jasmine let out a soft snort of agreement. My mother Brenda shifted in her seat, whispering something to my brother-in-law Trent, who crossed his arms and smirked at me. They all thought this was my desperate last stand. They thought the brown envelope held tear-stained letters or medical records detailing the stress of my business. They genuinely believed I was trying to beg the court for mercy. Julian's attorney stood up, puffing out his chest. "Objection, Your Honor. The plaintiff has already submitted a complete and sworn statement of assets. Any last-minute emotional appeals by the defense are highly irregular and irrelevant to the division of the technology company and the trust fund." Judge Rosalind Mercer did not even look at Julian's attorney. She kept her eyes fixed on Elias, who was patiently holding the envelope out toward the bench. Judge Mercer was a legend in the Fulton County Courthouse. She was a black woman in her 60s who had fought her way to the bench through decades of dealing with arrogant men exactly like Julian. She had a reputation for possessing a flawless lie detector and a distinct lack of patience for lawyers who tried to make a mockery of her courtroom. "I will allow it, Judge," Mercer said, her voice flat and bored. "Bring it here, Mr. Elias." Elias walked forward and handed the thick package to the bailiff, who passed it up to the judge. The courtroom grew incredibly still. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the rhythmic tapping of Julian's expensive pen against his legal pad. He was completely unbothered. He thought he had me backed into a corner with no way out. He thought his legal maneuvering was bulletproof. Judge Mercer picked up a silver letter opener from her desk. The sharp, tearing sound of the thick paper being sliced open seemed unnaturally loud. She pulled out the stack of documents. I watched her face carefully. I saw her put on her reading glasses, pushing them up the bridge of her nose. I saw her eyes scan the first page, then the second, then the third. The tension in the room began to shift. It started as a subtle change in the air. Julian's tapping pen slowed down. His attorney stopped puffing out his chest and leaned forward slightly, trying to get a look at the papers from across the room. In the gallery, Trent uncrossed his arms. The smug smiles on my mother's and sister's faces began to falter as the silence dragged on for 1 minute, then 2, then 3. Judge Mercer was a woman who usually kept her expressions completely unreadable. She was a fortress of judicial impartiality. But as she turned to the 4th page of the document, something incredible happened. Her eyebrows rose slightly. She stopped reading and looked back at the first page cross-referencing something. Then she looked at the 5th page. The courtroom was dead silent now. The kind of silence where you can hear your own heartbeat pounding in your ears. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, watching the man who had tried to destroy me begin to sweat. Julian adjusted his collar. He glanced back at his family seeking reassurance, but they looked just as confused as he was. Judge Mercer slowly lowered the stack of papers to her desk. She took off her reading glasses and folded them deliberately. She folded her hands together and leaned forward, staring a hole straight through Julian. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with an electric anticipation. And then Judge Mercer laughed. It was not a polite chuckle. It was a sharp, genuine laugh that cut through the silence like a knife. It was the sound of absolute disbelief mixed with dark amusement. It was the kind of laugh that immediately tells a courtroom that someone has made a fatal, catastrophic mistake. Julian's face went pale. His attorney looked terrified. Judge Mercer stopped laughing, but the amusement remained in her sharp eyes, turning them cold and deadly. She leaned closer to the microphone on her desk. Her voice was dripping with ice, holding a quiet menace that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Attorney Julian," she said, emphasizing his title like it was a dirty word. "Do you truly wish to submit this financial disclosure under penalty of perjury?" The word perjury hung in the sterile courtroom air, vibrating with a sudden violent energy. It was the same word that had been echoing in my mind for the last 6 months, ever since the day the blinders finally fell off. Staring at Julian's suddenly pale face, my mind snapped back to Thanksgiving at my mother's house. The exact day I realized my husband was a liar, and my family were his eager accomplices. I had arrived at Brenda's house that Thursday exhausted to my very bones. I had spent the last 92 hours surviving on black coffee and sheer adrenaline, negotiating the final terms of my series of funding round. My fintech app had just secured millions in venture capital. It was a monumental milestone for anyone, but for a Black female founder, it was practically unheard of. I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home in the suburbs, my body aching, but my spirit soaring. I was hoping for just a fraction of the celebration I had earned. I wanted my mother to hug me and tell me she was proud. I wanted my husband to look at me with admiration. I walked through the front door, the heavy scent of roasted turkey and collard greens washing over me, ready to share the best news of my professional life. The living room was loud and chaotic. My sister Jasmine was draped over the sofa, showing off a new designer bag, while Trent, her husband, stood by the fireplace swirling a glass of expensive bourbon. Trent was a white man who ran a vague consulting firm that never seemed to have any actual clients or generate any real revenue. He thrived on backhanded compliments and subtle racial microaggressions that my family conveniently ignored because he brought a certain perceived proximity to privilege that my mother desperately craved. When I walked in, there were no cheers and no warm greetings. I placed my coat on the chair, taking a deep breath to steady myself, and mentioned quietly that the funding round had officially closed. I looked around the room expecting a smile or a word of congratulations. Instead, Trent took a slow sip of his bourbon and smirked, looking me up and down. "Must be nice getting that Silicon Valley diversity quota money," he said, his voice dripping with casual condescension. "They are practically throwing cash at minority founders these days, just to look good for the press and hit their inclusion metrics." The words were designed to strip away my hard work to reduce my brilliance and sleepless nights to a charitable handout. I looked at my sister, expecting her to defend me, but Jasmine just rolled her eyes, examining her manicured nails, and went back to scrolling on her phone. Before I could even formulate a response to put Trent in his place, my mother walked in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a stained apron. She did not ask about my company. She did not tell my brother-in-law to watch his mouth in her house. Instead, she looked at me with a deep scowl of disapproval. "Vivian, stop standing around bragging about your little app," Brenda snapped, pointing toward the dining table. "Julian has been working hard at the law firm all week, providing for this family. Go fix your husband a plate and make sure he gets the dark meat. A successful black man like Julian needs a wife, not a CEO. He needs peace at home, not a woman constantly competing with him and acting like she is the man of the house." I swallowed the disrespect just like I had done my entire life. It is the ultimate burden of the strong black woman. We are expected to carry the weight of the world on our shoulders, to absorb the insults, to finance the family, to shrink our success, so we do not intimidate the fragile egos of the men around us. We are told to be grateful for the bare minimum while delivering absolute perfection. I walked into the kitchen, grabbing a heavy ceramic plate, and began piling it high with turkey and dressing. I could hear Julian's booming laugh echoing from the living room, soaking up my mother's adoration. He did not defend me either. He reveled in my subjugation. I was the financial engine of the entire family, but in that house I was nothing more than a servant meant to cater to his comfort. The kitchen was stiflingly hot, filled with the steam of boiling pots and the suffocating weight of my own resentment. I needed a moment to breathe, to collect myself before I snapped and ruined the holiday. I grabbed the heavy trash bag from the corner bin, deciding to take it out to the garage just to get 2 minutes of cold November air on my face. As I leaned over to tie the plastic strings together, my eyes caught a sudden glow on the kitchen island. Julian's iPad, which he had left sitting next to the fruit bowl, lit up with a new notification. I did not mean to look. I was never the type of wife to snoop through devices or check phone logs. I trusted my husband completely, but the text banner was large and bright, and the words seemed to burn themselves directly into my retinas before I could look away. It was a message from Lauren. Lauren was Jasmine's best friend, a woman who had been a bridesmaid at my wedding, who had eaten at my dining table, who had smiled in my face and called me sister for years. The message was short, but it carried the destructive force of a nuclear bomb dropping squarely on the life I thought I knew. "The escrow for our condo cleared. Did you wire the rest from the joint account?" I stood there frozen, the plastic trash bag digging painfully into my fingers. My mind stopped functioning for a fraction of a second as the words rearranged themselves into a devastating reality. Our condo. The joint account. Julian was not just having a cheap physical affair. He was buying real estate with my sister's best friend, using the money I had nearly killed myself to earn. He was using the money from our joint account, the account that held my tech consulting fees and my startup capital, to build a secret life with another woman. The betrayal was not just a physical infidelity, it was a calculated financial execution. And my family, the people sitting in the next room laughing and eating the food I paid for, the sister who was best friends with his mistress, the mother who constantly praised him, they had to know. My chest tightened as the air was sucked out of the room. I let the trash bag drop to the floor. I did not scream. I did not march into the living room and confront him. The judge in the courtroom asking Julian about perjury was the exact echo of the silent vow I made to myself in that kitchen 6 months ago as I stared at the glowing screen. I was going to destroy them all. I did not scream. I did not march into the living room and confront him. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing the oxygen into my burning lungs while staring at the glowing screen of the iPad. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to press them flat against the cold marble of the kitchen island to steady myself. The house was still filled with the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses from the dining room, but it all sounded like static to me now. The heavy scent of roasted turkey and holiday spices suddenly made my stomach turn. I turned away from the screen, leaving the trash bag abandoned on the floor. I needed to find Julian. I needed to look into his eyes and see if I could spot the monster hiding behind the charming smile I had loved for 5 years. I walked silently down the hallway, stepping carefully on the plush carpet to mask my footsteps. I checked the living room, but he was not there on the sofa, where Trent was currently pouring himself another drink. I checked the guest bathroom, but the door was wide open and empty. As I crept closer to the back of the house near the large walk-in pantry, I heard the low murmur of hushed voices. I pressed my back against the hallway wall, holding my breath. It was Julian and my sister Jasmine. And then I heard my mother Brenda's voice joining them. They were hiding in the pantry, surrounded by canned goods and holiday supplies, whispering like thieves in the night. The very people who were supposed to be my safe haven were huddled together in the dark. "I cannot keep stalling the credit card companies," Julian Jasmine was saying, her voice tight with a pathetic, familiar panic. "Trent maxed out the platinum card again for that stupid consulting retreat, and they are threatening to put a lien on our cars. You promised you would help us out this month. You know Mom cannot cover the mortgage if we default on the cars." "Relax, Jasmine," Julian replied, his tone dripping with that smooth, arrogant confidence he usually reserved for his corporate clients or the courtroom. "I told you I have it handled. Vivian's app is taking off faster than we thought. That series of funding just closed today, and her valuation is through the roof. You just need to hold off the creditors a little longer. I am not going to let you and Trent drown when there is a fortune sitting right across the hall." "What exactly is the plan, Julian?" my mother Brenda asked, sounding impatient but entirely supportive of his scheming. "I am not having my daughter Jasmine lose her house because Trent's business is struggling. You said you were going to take care of this before the holidays. You know how hard Jasmine works, and she deserves some peace of mind." The irony of my mother praising Jasmine's non-existent work ethic while plotting to steal my actual life savings almost made me laugh out loud. "I am going to lock down her assets before I file for divorce," Julian said coldly. The casual way he mentioned divorcing me sent a physical shockwave through my chest. "I am drawing up a post-nuptial agreement that she will sign because she is exhausted and naive and completely desperate to keep our marriage intact. You know how she is always trying to be the perfect wife. I will convince her the contract is necessary to protect the family from corporate liability now that her company is getting big. Once her signature is on that paper, I will have an ironclad legal claim to everything. I will make sure you and Mom get a generous cut to pay off Trent's debts and set you both up comfortably for the rest of your lives. Lauren already found the perfect condo for us once the dust settles, and I leave Vivian with nothing." I felt my knees go weak. My own mother was standing in a pantry plotting to strip me of my life's work to fund my sister's comfortable lifestyle with her lazy husband. And she knew about Lauren. She knew my husband was buying a condo with her youngest daughter's best friend. They all knew. They had been laughing in my face while secretly sharpening the knives they planned to plunge into my back. "Well, you better make sure the judge gives you the maximum payout," Brenda said without a single ounce of hesitation or maternal regret. "I will testify if I have to. I will get on that witness stand and swear to God that Vivian was an abusive wife. I will tell the court she neglected you, worked all hours of the night, and verbally abused you because she thought she was better than us with her Silicon Valley money. Whatever you need me to say, Julian, I will say it. She has always been too arrogant for her own good anyway, and she needs to be taught a lesson about family loyalty." The absolute malice in my mother's voice paralyzed me. This was the woman who gave birth to me. This was the sister I had protected and financed since we were teenagers. This was the husband I slept next to every single night. They were not just greedy, they were predators, and I was nothing but the prey they were preparing to slaughter for their own comfort. The burden of being the strong black woman had blinded me to the fact that I was carrying parasites. I did not burst through the pantry door. Confronting them now would only give them the opportunity to cover their tracks and hide their assets. Throwing a tantrum would only play into the narrative my mother was already constructing about me being an unstable, abusive wife. A truly powerful woman does not throw a fit when she is surrounded by enemies. She builds a fortress and prepares for war. I slowly stepped backward, moving away from the pantry door with absolute silence. Every muscle in my body was completely tense, but my mind was operating with a terrifying new clarity. I turned around and walked straight out the back door of the house, slipping into the freezing November night without grabbing my coat or my purse. The cold air hit my face like a physical blow, but it woke me up from the nightmare I had been living in for the past 5 years. I walked down the long paved driveway and got inside my car, locking the heavy doors behind me. The silence of the vehicle wrapped around me. My hands were no longer shaking. The crushing weight of trying to please these toxic people evaporated, leaving behind a chilling, sharp determination. They wanted to play legal games and steal my empire. They wanted to use the law to bleed me dry. I pulled my phone from my pocket, the screen illuminating the dark interior of my car. I scrolled through my contacts, ignoring the missed messages from my team celebrating our funding round. I scrolled until I found the personal number of Elias. Elias had been my corporate attorney for years, but he was also a veteran divorce lawyer who despised Julian with a burning, passionate hatred ever since Julian had crossed him on a corporate merger years ago. Elias was ruthless, meticulous, and waiting for an excuse to tear my husband apart. The phone rang twice before he answered, his gruff voice filling the quiet space of my car. Elias. I said, my voice remarkably steady and cold as ice. I need to build a guillotine and I want them to pull the lever themselves. 2 months passed after that Thanksgiving night. 2 months of smiling at a man I knew was planning to destroy me. 2 months of sitting across from my mother and sister, pretending I did not hear the knives they were sharpening behind my back. 4 months before our courtroom showdown, Julian finally made his move. He started his psychological warfare exactly the way Elias and I predicted he would. He did not come at me with anger or demands. Julian was a corporate lawyer, and he knew that the most effective way to trap a strong Black woman was to make her feel like she finally had a safe place to rest. He came home early on a Tuesday evening. The house smelled like expensive Italian takeout, and he had poured a glass of my favorite red wine. He loosened his silk tie and rolled up his sleeves, playing the part of the devoted, hard-working husband who just wanted to care for his exhausted wife. I walked through the door, dropping my keys on the counter, carrying the heavy burden of my company on my shoulders. Or at least, that is exactly what I let him see. I slumped my shoulders, purposely letting the exhaustion show on my face. Julian guided me to the living room sofa, handing me the wine. He rubbed my shoulders, his hands pressing into my muscles with a feigned gentleness that made my skin crawl. "You are working too hard, Vivian," he murmured, his voice smooth and dripping with fake concern. "I worry about you. This new funding round is incredible, but it puts a massive target on your back. The tech world is ruthless, and I see founders get sued every single day. One data breach, one disgruntled investor, one regulatory slip-up, and they could come after everything we own." I took a slow sip of the wine, looking down at my hands. I let my voice tremble just a little. "What do you mean, Julian?" I asked, playing the naive tech founder who did not understand the law. "I have corporate insurance. They cannot touch our personal assets." He sighed, a heavy, patronizing sound designed to make me feel small and unprotected. "Corporate veils get pierced all the time, Vivian," he said, moving to sit beside me. "Plaintiff attorneys are sharks. If your app faces a class action lawsuit, they will try to liquidate our house, our savings, everything I have worked for at the firm, and everything you are trying to build. I cannot let them do that to us. I cannot let them hurt you." He reached into his leather briefcase, sitting by the coffee table, and pulled out a thick stack of legal paper. He set it gently on my lap. "I have been consulting with some senior partners at my firm." Julian lied smoothly. "We drafted a post-nuptial agreement. It is a standard asset separation strategy. We legally divide our holdings so that if your company gets sued, my assets and my investments are completely shielded from the fallout. And more importantly, we structure your founder shares so that they fall under a joint protection umbrella that I can legally defend as your husband and legal counsel." I stared at the stack of paper. My heart beat in a slow, steady rhythm. Elias had warned me this was coming. Julian wanted to sever his own money completely, insulating the funds he was stealing to buy a condo with Lauren, while simultaneously wrapping his greedy fingers around the core equity of my $12 million app. I opened the document and skimmed the pages, pretending to be overwhelmed by the legal jargon. I did not need to read it closely to know it was a death warrant. The contract was heavily skewed. It dictated that all of his current and future investments were his sole separate property. Meanwhile, it gave him a massive controlling stake in my fintech company under the guise of legal stewardship. It was brilliant in its cruelty. "This looks so complicated," I whispered, letting my voice crack. My hands shook holding the paper. I looked up at him, widening my eyes to show pure, unfiltered panic. "Are we really in that much danger, Julian? Is the company going to ruin us?" Julian wrapped his arm around me, pulling me against his chest. I could smell the faint trace of Lauren's perfume on his collar. I fought the urge to gag. "Hey, look at me," he said, his voice taking on that sickeningly sweet, reassuring tone. "I am a lawyer, Vivian. My entire job is protecting wealth. You are a brilliant software developer, but you do not know how vicious the courts can be. You focus on your code and your team. Let me carry this burden for you. Sign the agreement and I promise no one will ever be able to take what we have." It took everything in me not to laugh in his face. He was so deeply arrogant, so convinced of his own superior intellect, that he truly believed I was nothing more than a stressed-out woman, desperate for a man to save her. He believed his gaslighting was working perfectly. I forced tears into my eyes, letting them well up and spill over my lashes. I let out a broken little sob, leaning my head against his chest. I let him feel my manufactured weakness. "Whatever you think is best to protect us." "Julian," I cried, my voice muffled against his expensive shirt. "I trust you. I just want us to be safe." I felt his chest expand as he took a deep breath, his ego swelling to massive proportions. He stroked my hair, completely blind to the trap closing around him. He thought he had successfully manipulated the strong, independent black woman into signing away her empire. He had no idea that the post-nuptial agreement he just handed me was the exact weapon Elias and I needed to legally separate his assets before we executed the final killing blow. The very next morning, the sun was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my corner office in downtown Atlanta. I was sitting at my glass desk, looking out over the city skyline, feeling a strange sense of peace. Julian's post-nuptial agreement was sitting in my briefcase, ready to be weaponized. My focus was suddenly broken by the sound of my assistant protesting outside my door. Before I could pick up the phone, the heavy oak door swung open and Trent walked in. He did not knock. He did not apologize. He just strolled past my visibly distressed assistant like he owned the entire building. Trent was wearing faded jeans and a casual polo shirt, a stark contrast to the professional environment of my fintech headquarters. He flashed a lazy, entitled smile and dropped his sunglasses right on top of my quarterly financial reports. "It is okay, Pamela," I told my assistant, who was hovering anxiously in the doorway. "He is my brother-in-law. I will handle this." She nodded and closed the door, leaving me alone with the parasite my sister had married. Trent sank into one of the expensive leather chairs opposite my desk, crossing his ankle over his knee. "Nice setup you have here, Vivian," he said, looking around the room with a subtle sneer. "Gotta admit, it is pretty impressive what a little diversity funding can buy these days." I kept my face completely blank, resting my hands on the glass surface of my desk. "What do you want, Trent?" I asked, my voice even. "I have board meetings all morning." He chuckled, a dry, grating sound that set my teeth on edge. "Always all business, right? No time for family." That is exactly what your mother and Jasmine were saying last night. They are really worried about you, Vivian. They think all this ambition is making you selfish, forgetting where you came from and who supported you when you were just sitting in a basement typing code. I stared at him. My family had never supported me. They had mocked my ambition until it started generating revenue. Trent leaned forward, dropping the casual act. "Look, I am not here to chat. My consulting firm is expanding, and we are offering a new tier of strategic advisory services. I have put you down for our premium package. It is $50,000. Consider it a retainer for my expertise." I let out a short breath of disbelief. $50,000? For what exactly, Trent? You do not have any background in financial technology. You do not even have a website for this supposed consulting firm. What exactly am I paying for? Trent sighed, running a hand through his hair like he was dealing with a stubborn child. You are paying for peace in your family, Vivian. Your mom is already stressed out about you neglecting Julian. She thinks you are getting too big for your britches. If I go back and tell her that her rich, successful daughter refused to invest in her own brother-in-law, her own family, well, you know how Brenda gets. She will make your life a living hell. You owe this family for putting up with your obsession with this company. It was extortion, plain and simple, wrapped up in the toxic expectations of the strong black woman trope. I was supposed to bleed myself dry to fund the failures of a mediocre white man, just to keep my mother from throwing a tantrum. He stood there dripping in unearned privilege, weaponizing my own mother's internal misogyny and racial bias against me. Any other day I would have called security and had him thrown out onto the street. But today, I needed him to be exactly this greedy. Today, his arrogance was the key to unlocking the federal crimes he and Julian were committing. I let my shoulders slump, adopting the same defeated posture I had used with Julian the night before. "Fine," I said softly, looking away, as if he had successfully shamed me. "I will write you the check. But my accounting department is incredibly strict now that we have venture capital backing. I cannot just write a personal check for $50,000. It has to be a vendor payment to your business account." Trent's eyes lit up with pure, unadulterated greed. He thought he had completely dominated the room. He thought his manipulative threats had broken my spirit. "That works for me," he said, pulling a business card out of his wallet and tossing it onto my desk. "Make it payable to Apex Strategic Solutions, LLC, and make sure you note that it is for corporate advisory services." "I need the exact routing and account numbers for the wire transfer," I told him, pulling a corporate checkbook from my drawer. "For tax purposes. The IRS is very particular about large vendor payouts. I do not want either of us getting audited." Trent laughed, a sharp barking sound. "Do not worry about my taxes, Vivian. Julian set up the LLC structure for me. It is bulletproof. Just send the money to the account written on the back of that card." I flipped the card over. There, in Trent's messy handwriting, were the exact routing and account numbers Elias and I had been searching for. The shadow account where Julian was funneling our marital assets. I picked up my pen and wrote out a corporate check for $50,000. Every stroke of the pen felt like a physical victory. I was buying the nails for their coffins. I tore the check from the book and slid it across the glass desk. Trent snatched it up, examining the signature with a satisfied smirk. He folded it and slid it into his pocket, standing up from the leather chair. "Good doing business with you, Vivian," he said, walking toward the door. "Try to make it to Sunday dinner this week. Your mom wants to see if you still remember how to cook for your husband." The heavy oak door clicked shut behind him. I did not move for several seconds, listening to the sound of his footsteps fading down the carpeted hallway. The silence in my office returned, but it was no longer heavy. It felt charged and electric. Behind me, the discreet door that led to my private adjoining conference room slowly clicked open. Elias stepped out holding a legal pad and a pen. His face was completely impassive, but his eyes were sharp and focused. He walked over to my desk, looking at the spot where Trent had been sitting just moments before. "You have the routing numbers?" Elias asked, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. I picked up the business card Trent had left behind and handed it across the desk to my lawyer. I looked at the handwritten numbers that would soon bring down the federal government on my entire family. "Track every penny," I said. "Track every penny," I said to Elias as I watched him leave my office. That night, the atmosphere in my house was suffocatingly festive. Julian had invited my mother Brenda and my sister Jasmine over for dinner, under the guise of a casual family gathering. In reality, it was a victory lap. They were in the living room, popping a $200 bottle of champagne, laughing loudly enough for the sound to carry all the way down the hall to my home office. Julian was celebrating his own genius legal maneuvering. He had handed me the final printed copy of the post-nuptial agreement earlier that evening, with a sad, sympathetic look on his face, telling me to take my time reading it over. He told my mother and sister that I was in my office crying over the stress of my business and coming to terms with the contract. They were out there toasting to my supposed breakdown, to the millions of dollars they thought they were about to legally steal from me. I could hear the clinking of their crystal glasses and Jasmine's high-pitched giggle as Julian poured another round. I was not crying. I sat at my heavy mahogany desk, the post-nuptial agreement, sitting untouched next to my keyboard. The glow of my computer monitors illuminated the dark room. I was not reading Julian's contract because I already knew exactly what it said. Elias and I had analyzed a digital copy he had managed to secure days ago. Instead, I was logged into my corporate registry portal and the private banking interface for the irrevocable trust left to me by my late father. My father was the only person in my family who ever truly saw my worth. Before he passed away, he set up this trust knowing that my mother, Brenda, was terrible with money and that I would need protection. He had explicitly structured it as an irrevocable trust, which meant that under United States law, the assets held within it were completely shielded from marital property divisions. A spouse cannot touch an irrevocable trust in a divorce. It is a legal fortress. Julian was a brilliant lawyer, but his arrogance was his massive blind spot. He was so focused on locking down my future corporate earnings and protecting his own hidden offshore accounts that he never bothered to check the current ownership structure of my company. He assumed because I was the founder that the shares were held in my personal name. He assumed I was just a naive tech developer who did not understand asset management. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I was executing a flawless legal counterstrike right under his nose while he drank champagne 50 feet away. Using my unilateral authority as the sole founder and majority shareholder, I began the transfer process. I took the core intellectual property of the fintech app, the algorithms, the patents, the proprietary data structures, and transferred absolute ownership into my father's irrevocable trust. Then I moved all of my founder's shares, the exact shares that gave the company its $12 million valuation, out of my personal portfolio and directly into the trust. The progress bar on my screen slowly filled from left to right. Each percentage point felt like a heavy chain falling off my shoulders. I thought about all the years I had spent carrying the financial burden of my mother and my sister. I thought about the thousands of dollars I had given them, the cars I had helped pay off, the medical bills I had covered just to be treated like an inconvenience. I thought about Julian sleeping in my bed while funneling my hard-earned money to my sister's best friend. They thought they were stripping me to the bone. They thought they were leaving me with nothing but the clothes on my back. The screen flashed green, indicating the transfer was successful and legally binding. It was done. I was no longer the owner of my own company. My father's trust was the owner, and I was simply an employee of that trust. I let out a long breath, leaning back in my leather chair. My father was still protecting me from the grave, wrapping his arms around my life to shield me from the vultures in the living room. I picked up the heavy silver pen from my desk and finally pulled Julian's postnuptial agreement toward me. I flipped to the very last page. Julian had drafted this document to ensure he kept all his investments, giving him a massive controlling stake in my company while separating us from any shared liabilities. But in his boilerplate legal language, he had included a standard clause stating that any pre-existing trust assets belonging to either party could not be touched or divided in the event of a divorce. He put that clause in there to protect himself and to sound perfectly fair on paper. He just legally agreed that trust assets cannot be touched. I signed my name on the dotted line, my signature bold and clear. I signed every single page, initialing exactly where he had placed the little yellow sticky notes. I was legally binding myself to his trap, knowing that the cheese he thought he put on the mousetrap was no longer there. He had just guaranteed that he would walk away from our marriage with absolutely zero claim to my $12 million company. I closed the folder, smoothing my hand over the leather cover. I stood up from my desk, pushing my chair back quietly. I practiced my expression in the dark reflection of the computer monitor, softening my eyes and making myself look small, defeated, and hopelessly devoted to my husband. I picked up the signed contract and walked out of my office, stepping into the brightly lit hallway. The sound of my family laughing grew louder as I approached the living room, ready to hand them the very weapon that would eventually sever their heads. I walked into the living room and handed Julian the signed post-nuptial agreement, playing the role of the defeated wife to absolute perfection. He took the folder with a triumphant smirk, totally unaware that he had just signed away his future. 3 months after I handed Julian that contract, the illusion of our marriage finally shattered completely. It was exactly 1 month ago when he officially filed for divorce. He did not do it quietly or with any shred of dignity. He wanted to humiliate me. He had the divorce papers served to me right in the middle of a board meeting at my company office, ensuring that my entire executive team watched me receive them. The very next day, he made his relationship with Lauren completely public. They posted pictures together on social media, drinking champagne on the balcony of the new condo that he had bought using my stolen money. My sister Jasmine immediately commented on the photos with heart emojis, calling them the perfect couple. I knew the public disrespect was designed to break my focus and force me into an emotional reaction, but I stayed entirely silent. I let them have their public victory lap. What I did not expect was the invasion of my own home. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I had left the office a few hours early because I was feeling a migraine coming on. I took the private elevator up to our downtown penthouse. When the doors opened directly into the foyer, I stopped dead in my tracks. The apartment was in absolute chaos. The large custom velvet sectional sofa that I had special ordered from Italy was gone. The walls, which usually held my collection of contemporary black art, were stripped completely bare, leaving behind nothing but pale square outlines on the paint. I walked further into the living room, my heels clicking against the hardwood floor. There, standing in the middle of my half-empty penthouse, were my mother Brenda and my sister Jasmine. They were surrounded by cardboard boxes and bubble wrap. Jasmine was wearing one of my expensive silk scarves draped casually around her neck, and she was holding a stack of my designer handbags. My mother was directing two moving men pointing toward the vintage dining table that my father had bought for me before he passed away. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, playing the part of the shocked and devastated wife perfectly. My mother did not even have the decency to look guilty. She turned to me with a cold, hard stare, smoothing her hands down the front of her blouse. "Julian said we could come get some things," she stated casually, as if she were picking up groceries instead of looting my home. "He filed the divorce papers. Vivian, these are marital assets now, and since he is legally entitled to half, he told me I could take whatever I wanted to furnish Jasmine's new guest room. He has been so generous with us, making sure his family is taken care of during this difficult transition." "His family," I repeated, letting my voice tremble. "Mom, this is my apartment. I bought that dining table. Those are my handbags." Jasmine let out a loud, dramatic sigh, shifting the stack of stolen leather goods onto her hip. "Oh, please, Vivian, do not start with the dramatic victim act," she sneered, looking me up and down with utter contempt. "Julian is the one who has been suffering for years, dealing with your cold, calculating corporate attitude. He finally found someone who actually knows how to love him and treat him right. Lauren is going to make him so much happier than you ever did. You brought this on yourself. You should not have been such a bitter wife." The absolute cruelty in her voice echoed through the empty spaces of the penthouse. My own sister was standing in my living room, stealing my clothes and telling me I deserved to be cheated on with her best friend. My mother was stealing the last piece of furniture my dead father had given me, specifically to punish me for not being submissive enough to a man who was robbing me blind. Any normal person would have lost their mind. Any normal person would have pulled out their phone and dialed 911 to report a robbery in progress. I could have had them both arrested for theft and trespassing right then and there. But Elias had told me to let them dig their own graves. If I called the police now, Julian would just claim it was a misunderstanding over marital property. It would be a messy domestic dispute that might slow down the divorce proceedings and give him time to look closer at my corporate filings. I needed him to stay arrogant. I needed him to believe that I was so broken, so completely crushed by his departure, that I could not even fight back. So I did not scream. I did not reach for my phone to call the police. I let my shoulders drop and I looked at the floor, forcing a single tear to escape and run down my cheek. I let them see me cry. I walked right past them. My head hung low and went into my master bedroom. Julian had already cleared out his closet, but my side was completely ransacked. Jasmine had clearly been through my jewelry boxes. I ignored the empty velvet display cases. I pulled a single medium-sized suitcase from the top shelf and quietly packed enough clothes to last me a few weeks. I packed my essential documents, my laptop, and the few remaining sentimental items they had not yet managed to steal. When I walked back out into the living room, pulling the single suitcase behind me, my mother and sister stopped talking. They watched me, their faces a mixture of triumph and fake pity. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully driven the rich, arrogant CEO out of her own castle. "I am leaving," I whispered, my voice perfectly mimicking a woman who had simply given up. "Tell Julian he can have whatever is left." I did not wait for their response. I walked into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby, letting the doors slide shut on their smug faces. I left the luxury penthouse behind and drove straight to a modest one-bedroom apartment I had rented under a corporate alias a week prior. It was small, basic, and completely anonymous. I unpacked my single suitcase in the quiet, empty room. I embraced the underdog persona entirely. I was going to let them think they had utterly broken me. I was going to let them strip the penthouse bare, let Julian flaunt his mistress, and let my family believe they had finally put the strong black woman in her place. I was going to let them feast on their fake victory, because I knew the slaughterhouse was waiting for them at the end of the month. The silence of my new, modest apartment was only broken by the constant buzzing of my phone. I sat on a cheap mattress on the floor, watching the screen light up over and over again. Jasmine and Trent had launched their digital offensive. They took to social media with the kind of coordinated smear campaign that only bored, entitled people have the time to orchestrate. They did not name me directly at first. They used the cowardly tactic of passive-aggressive posts overlaid on aesthetic backgrounds. Jasmine posted a picture of herself and Lauren, my husband's mistress, clinking mimosa glasses with a long caption about cutting out toxic family members who let money rot their souls. She wrote about how true family is about loyalty, and how some people forget where they came from the second they get a little taste of success. It was a masterclass in projection. Trent, of course, had to add his own flavor of subtle bigotry to the mix. He posted a rambling status update on his professional networking page about how true men stand tall when their overly ambitious wives try to emasculate them. He tagged Julian, praising him for his strength and claiming the family was supporting Julian through his healing journey. My mother Brenda was in the comment sections of every single post, leaving praying hands emojis and replying to strangers about how her heart was broken by her eldest daughter's cruel behavior. They were spinning a web of absolute lies, painting me as the villain in a story where I was the only one actually bleeding. The gaslighting was broadcast to our entire network of family and friends in Atlanta. The narrative they spun was meticulous and deeply damaging. I was cast as the cold, calculating tech founder who abandoned her marriage vows for venture capital. Julian was presented as the long-suffering husband who was finally breaking free from my emotional abuse. The social fallout was immediate and deeply painful to watch. My phone was flooded with text messages and voicemails from mutual friends. Some were just fishing for gossip, while others were genuinely confused by the sudden public spectacle. Women I had mentored, young founders I had invited to my home, called me, asking if the rumors were true. They wanted to know why I was making Julian sleep on a friend's couch. They wanted to know if I had really thrown my own mother out of my penthouse. The lies were so outrageous, so completely detached from reality, that explaining the truth felt like stepping into quicksand. I knew that if I tried to defend myself, if I posted screenshots of Julian's affair or Trent's extorted checks, I would just be playing their game. So I chose absolute silence. I did not reply to a single comment. I did not post a defending statement on my own pages. I did not return the calls of the gossiping aunts and fake friends who were suddenly so concerned about my marriage. Elias had warned me that public battles only give opposing counsel ammunition. "Every word you write online is $1 you hand to Julian," he had said to me. "Let them scream into the void. Let them build their house of cards as high as they want, because the wind is coming." I embraced that silence like a heavy suit of armor. I let my reputation take the hit in their shallow social circles. I let them whisper about me at Sunday brunches and country club dinners. I knew that engaging with them would only feed the monster they were trying to create. They wanted me to crack. They wanted me to post an angry rant or show up at my mother's house screaming and crying. They needed me to play the angry black woman stereotype so Julian could walk into court and point to my behavior as proof of his emotional distress. They were baiting a trap and waiting for me to step on the trigger. Instead of fighting internet trolls, I channeled every single ounce of my rage into my company. My executive team and I were in the final grueling stages of preparing for our initial public offering. Going public was the ultimate validation of everything I had built. While Jasmine was busy buying fake followers to boost her lifestyle blog, I was sitting in windowless conference rooms with investment bankers and federal regulators. I spent my days reviewing prospectuses, auditing compliance reports, and finalizing the roadshow presentations that would pitch my fintech app to the biggest institutional investors in the world. The corporate restructuring I had done that night in my office, transferring the intellectual property to my father's trust, was the cornerstone of our financial stability. My team thought I was just being a meticulous founder, getting our assets aligned before the public launch. They had no idea I was also building an impenetrable wall against my greedy husband. The contrast between my two worlds was sharp and surreal. By day, I was a visionary CEO, steering a $12 million enterprise toward the stock market. By night, I was returning to a sparse, anonymous apartment, eating cheap takeout and reading the malicious lies my own blood relatives were spreading about me online. The pressure was immense, but it only sharpened my focus. Every lie Jasmine posted, every fake tear my mother shed online, every smug comment Trent made just fueled my determination to ruin them completely. About 2 weeks into their relentless smear campaign, the bait finally arrived directly to my phone. It was late on a Friday night. I was sitting at my small kitchen table, reviewing a final draft of our registration statement for the Securities and Exchange Commission. My phone vibrated with a text message from Julian. I stared at his name on the screen. The man who was currently living with my sister's best friend, using the money he stole from my accounts to buy her furniture. I opened the message. It was dripping with the same sickening arrogance he wore like a second skin. "You can still settle out of court, Viv," the message read. "Give me the 6 million and I will call off the dogs. It is better than dragging this out and letting everyone see how crazy you have become. Just sign the check, and Jasmine will delete the posts." He really thought he held all the cards. He thought the social pressure and the public humiliation were breaking my spirit. He actually believed that $6 million was a fair price to pay for my peace of mind, and that he was being generous by offering it. I looked at his message for a long time, listening to the quiet hum of my empty apartment. I did not type out a furious reply about his infidelity. I did not threaten him with the federal tax forms Elias and I had uncovered. I did not tell him that his post-nuptial agreement had already sealed his fate. I simply tapped the screen and replied with a single thumbs-up emoji. Then I put my phone on silent, turned back to my corporate filings, and continued preparing for the day I would bury him alive. The day of the deposition arrived with a heavy gray sky hanging over Atlanta. I did not go inside the conference room. Elias had advised me to stay in the hallway, sitting on a stiff wooden bench outside the glass doors. He knew that my presence might put Julian on guard, making him more careful with his words. We needed him completely relaxed and completely arrogant. Julian walked into the waiting area, flanked by his flashy defense attorney. He was wearing another custom suit, checking his expensive watch, like this entire legal proceeding was nothing more than a minor delay in his busy schedule. He barely glanced at me as he walked through the heavy doors into the deposition room. He thought I was banished to the hallway because I was too weak to face him. He had no idea I was just waiting for the executioner to drop the blade. Inside the room, a court reporter set up her stenography machine, ready to capture every single word under oath. Elias played his part flawlessly. From what we had planned, Elias was going to lean into his age, playing the role of a bumbling out-of-touch older lawyer who was close to retirement and struggling to keep up with modern corporate finance. Elias fumbled with his legal pads, dropping a pen and taking an agonizingly long time to adjust his reading glasses. Julian sat across the polished mahogany table exchanging amused smirks with his own attorney. They thought Elias was a dinosaur. They thought the deposition was going to be a pathetic fishing expedition by a lawyer who was completely out of his depth. The recording started and Julian was sworn in. He raised his right hand and solemnly swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, under the strict penalty of perjury. Elias began with the most mundane, agonizingly slow questions. He asked about Julian's employment history, his basic salary structure, and his daily living expenses. Julian answered with clipped, condescending responses, treating Elias like a slow child who needed simple concepts explained to him over and over again. Julian leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms and practically yawning as Elias stumbled over financial terms, deliberately mispronouncing the names of basic accounting software. Then Elias slowly and methodically shifted the conversation toward the marital assets. He asked about the joint bank accounts and the standard household expenses. Julian confirmed the numbers effortlessly, still riding the high of his own perceived superiority. He was so focused on making sure his narrative of being the primary breadwinner sounded convincing that he completely missed the subtle shift in Elias' tone. Elias pushed his reading glasses down the bridge of his nose, shuffling through a stack of seemingly disorganized papers. He asked Julian about his future financial plans and whether he held any accounts outside of the primary banking institutions they had already discussed. Julian laughed, a short, breathy sound of pure confidence. He looked directly at the court reporter, making sure she captured his absolute certainty. He stated for the record that his only income derived exclusively from his salary at his law firm. He swore that he had zero alternative income streams. He claimed he possessed no other real estate assets, no hidden portfolios, and absolutely no separate corporate holdings. He was painting a picture of a transparent, honest man who was simply trying to secure his fair share of his ambitious wife's tech company. Elias nodded slowly, acting as if he was merely checking boxes on a standard form. He flipped to another page of his notepad, his voice dropping to a casual conversational volume. He asked Julian specifically if he had any financial interests in any consulting firms or if he held any offshore accounts in the Caribbean or the Cayman Islands. Julian did not even hesitate. He wanted to hide the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had embezzled from my accounts to buy Lauren's luxury condo. He wanted to hide the massive tax evasion scheme he had set up with Trent, using my mother Brenda as the ultimate scapegoat. Julian looked directly at Elias and firmly denied everything. He swore under oath that he had never funneled money to any offshore entities. He swore that he had no financial relationship with any consulting firms whatsoever. He stated with absolute unwavering confidence that every single dollar he owned was perfectly accounted for in the initial financial disclosures he had submitted to the court. He was so desperate to protect the stolen money that he willingly tied the noose around his own neck and stepped firmly onto the trapdoor. He had just committed federal perjury multiple times in a matter of minutes, and it was all perfectly captured on the legal record. The trap was sprung. Elias did not press him further. He did not pull out the wire transfer receipts or the routing numbers we had secured from Trent. He did not confront Julian with the evidence of his massive fraud. Letting Julian know he was caught would only give him time to hire a criminal defense attorney and attempt to cover his tracks before the actual trial. Elias simply let the silence stretch across the room, allowing Julian's perjury to solidify in the official transcript. Julian smiled, thinking he had successfully navigated the deposition without giving up a single piece of useful information. He thought he had won. Elias slowly closed his leather notepad. He took off his reading glasses and slipped them into his breast pocket. His bumbling, confused demeanor vanished in an instant, replaced by the sharp, lethal presence of a veteran litigator who had just secured a flawless victory. He looked across the table at the arrogant man who had tried to destroy my life. "Thank you, Julian," Elias said, his voice carrying a quiet, chilling weight. "Your certainty is refreshing." Elias stood up, pushing his chair back. He did not wait for Julian's attorney to make any closing remarks. He gathered his briefcase and walked straight out of the conference room, leaving Julian sitting at the table with a sudden, creeping sense of unease slowly washing over his face. The heavy glass doors opened and Elias stepped out into the hallway where I was waiting patiently on the wooden bench. He walked over to me, his face completely impassive. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver flash drive containing the digital audio file of the deposition. He handed the flash drive to me without a single word of celebration. We did not need to speak. The metal was cold against my palm. I wrapped my fingers tightly around the drive, feeling the weight of Julian's self-inflicted destruction resting safely in my hand. Elias and I walked out of the courthouse complex in complete silence. We did not celebrate in the parking lot or stop for coffee. There was still too much work to be done. We drove in separate cars to a sleek, unmarked glass building on the edge of the financial district. This was where a forensic accountant named David had been working in a secure, windowless room for the past 2 weeks. David was a former federal auditor who specialized in unraveling complex corporate fraud, and he had been eagerly waiting for us to arrive. I walked into the cold, air-conditioned room and placed the silver flash drive containing Julian's perjured testimony onto the metal table. David barely looked up from his bank of glowing monitors. He simply nodded and handed me a different black flash drive. This was the culmination of his exhaustive financial autopsy. The $50,000 check I had written to Trent the previous week was the golden key that had unlocked the entire labyrinth. David had taken those routing numbers and relentlessly tracked every single digital footprint attached to Apex Strategic Solutions, LLC. Elias pulled up a chair beside me as David projected his findings onto a large screen on the wall. The spreadsheet was a tangled web of red and black numbers, but David highlighted the primary flow of capital. It was worse than we had initially thought. We knew Julian had been bleeding our joint marital accounts to fund his secret life, and we knew he had wired the down payment for the luxury condo he was buying with Lauren. But the money trail did not stop there. The real estate purchase was just a drop in the bucket compared to the massive scale of the criminal enterprise staring back at me from the screen. David explained that Julian and Trent were operating a highly sophisticated money laundering and tax evasion syndicate. Julian had been taking massive under-the-table kickbacks from his wealthy corporate clients at the law firm. To avoid reporting this income to the Internal Revenue Service and paying federal taxes, Julian had funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars through Trent's fake consulting firm. Trent was acting as the designated launderer. He would generate fake invoices for non-existent corporate advisory services, clean the dirty money through the LLC, take a hefty 20% cut to fund Jasmine's lavish designer lifestyle, and then filter the remaining clean money back into Julian's hidden offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. It was a federal crime of massive proportions. They were defrauding the United States government on a staggering scale. Julian was a corporate attorney who understood exactly how severe the penalties for this kind of tax evasion were. The federal authorities do not play games with white-collar fraud. If the IRS ever audited Apex Strategic Solutions, the Department of Justice would hand down indictments, carrying decades in federal prison. Elias leaned forward, resting his elbows on the metal table. He asked David a very simple question. Who is the registered agent of the LLC? Julian and Trent were incredibly arrogant, but Elias knew they were not stupid enough to put their own names on the state registry documents for a fraudulent shell company. They needed a scapegoat. They needed a dummy director, a sacrificial lamb who would absorb the absolute full force of the federal indictment when the house of cards inevitably collapsed. David clicked a few buttons on his keyboard and brought up the official articles of incorporation filed with the state of Georgia. He enlarged the scanned PDF document, zooming in on the final page. My breath caught in my throat and the room seemed to lose all its oxygen. I stared at the screen. There on the digital document was the looping cursive handwriting I had known my entire life. It was the exact same signature that had signed my childhood permission slips and the birthday cards I used to keep in my nightstand. The primary registered agent and sole managing director of the illegal money laundering operation was Brenda, my mother. I sat back in my chair, feeling a cold, dark wave of realization wash over me. The absolute irony of the situation was almost suffocating. For the past 6 months, my mother had been conspiring with Julian to destroy my life. She had stood in my half-empty penthouse stealing the furniture my dead father had bought me. She had cheered for the man who was sleeping with my sister's best friend. She had posted on social media about how toxic I was and how proud she was to support Julian's healing journey. She thought she was part of the winning team. She believed that Julian was the wealthy, generous savior who was going to take care of her and Jasmine while leaving me with absolutely nothing. My mother had no idea that her beloved golden son-in-law and her favorite daughter's husband had legally positioned her to take the fall for a multi-million-dollar federal tax fraud scheme. They had used her blind loyalty and her greed against her. They probably handed her a stack of papers, told her it was just some routine tax documents for Trent's new business, and she signed them without reading a single word because she trusted the men in the family more than she ever trusted me. If the feds came knocking tomorrow, Julian and Trent would point the finger directly at her. They would walk away clean while an older black woman took the maximum sentence in a federal penitentiary. They set up their own mother as the ultimate shield. Elias looked at me, his eyes grave and quiet. He asked me what I wanted to do with this information. He told me that we had enough evidence right now to send all three of them to prison before the divorce trial even began. I looked back at my mother's signature on the screen, staring at the death warrant. She did not even know she had signed. She wanted to see me ruined. She wanted to watch me lose everything I had built. I did not feel a single drop of pity for her. I looked at Elias and told him to put the documents in a brown envelope. We were going to let Julian walk into court and demand half of my empire, and then we were going to drop the sky on their heads. The air in the courtroom felt so thin it was almost impossible to breathe as I snapped back to the present moment. Judge Rosalind Mercer was still staring down from the bench, the sharp echo of her genuine laughter slowly fading into the high, vaulted ceiling. Julian was standing at his table, his expensive custom suit suddenly looking like a cheap costume. He had walked into this trial expecting a coronation, expecting the court to hand him the keys to my $12 million fintech empire on a silver platter. My mother Brenda and my sister Jasmine were sitting directly behind him, their smug smiles frozen on their faces as they tried to understand why the judge was laughing at the man who was supposed to make them all rich. Judge Mercer placed the thick stack of papers back onto her heavy oak desk. She smoothed her hands flat against the polished wood and fixed her gaze entirely on my husband. Attorney Julian. She began, her voice dropping to a low, conversational tone that commanded absolute silence from everyone in the gallery. You submitted a highly detailed demand for 50% of your wife's corporate holdings. You also submitted a post-nuptial agreement that you claim dictates the precise separation of your marital assets. Julian puffed out his chest, straightening his silk tie. He believed he was in his element now. He thought the judge was simply verifying the brilliance of his legal maneuvering. Yes, Your Honor, he said, his voice projecting confidence and unearned authority. I personally drafted that post-nuptial agreement to protect both parties and ensure an equitable distribution of all future liabilities and holdings. It is an ironclad document. Judge Mercer nodded slowly, her expression giving absolutely nothing away. She flipped to the second page of the documents Elias had provided in the brown envelope. "You drafted this document yourself," she asked, her tone completely neutral. "You did not use outside counsel or a neutral third-party mediator to construct the terms of this asset division." Julian smiled a deeply arrogant smirk that made my stomach turn. He glanced back at my mother, who beamed at him with maternal pride. "That is correct, Your Honor," he boasted. "I am a senior corporate litigator. I handle complex asset protection for a living. I applied my professional expertise to safeguard my family." Judge Mercer leaned forward, resting her chin on her folded hands. "Then you should be intimately familiar with the exact wording of Section 4 of your own contract," she said. Julian nodded eagerly, completely oblivious to the trap clamping shut around his ankles. "Of course, Your Honor." Judge Mercer picked up the post-nuptial agreement. "Then allow me to read Section 4 into the official court record," she announced. "It states clearly and unambiguously that any and all assets held within a pre-existing, irrevocable trust belonging to either party are completely exempt from marital property division. It explicitly waives any future claims by either spouse to the contents of such trusts, regardless of when the assets were acquired or how much their valuation has increased during the marriage." Julian let out a short, breathy chuckle of relief. He looked across the aisle at Elias and then at me, shaking his head slightly, as if we were wasting the court's time. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "I included that standard clause to protect a small trust fund my wife inherited from her late father. It contains a negligible amount of cash. We are not disputing the trust fund. We are petitioning for 50% of the founder's shares of her financial technology company." Elias sat perfectly still next to me, not moving a single muscle. I kept my eyes locked on Julian, watching the absolute pinnacle of his arrogance right before the freefall. Judge Mercer did not smile. She reached back into the brown envelope and pulled out a freshly printed stack of corporate filings featuring the unmistakable seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission. She held the papers up so the gallery could see the heavy black ink. "That brings us to the supplementary evidence submitted by defense counsel," Judge Mercer said, her voice slicing through the courtroom like a razor blade. "I am holding the updated SEC corporate registry and capitalization table for the financial technology company in question. This document was filed and legally executed exactly 1 hour before your wife signed your ironclad post-nuptial agreement 4 months ago." The courtroom was so quiet I could hear the soft rustle of the paper in the judge's hands. Julian's attorney suddenly sat up very straight, his eyes darting between his client and the bench. "According to these federal filings," Judge Mercer continued, pronouncing every single syllable with devastating clarity, "Vivian owns exactly 0 shares of this company in her personal name. She holds no equity, no founder shares, and no personal stake in the corporate entity you are trying to divide." Julian froze, his mouth slightly open. The color began to rapidly drain from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, pale gray. His attorney stood up half out of his chair, stammering, "Your Honor, that is impossible. My client verified her founder shares before drafting the agreement. She is the CEO. She is an employee of the company, Attorney Judge." Mercer snapped, silencing the man instantly. "Because according to these legally binding federal documents, 100% of the intellectual property, the patents, the algorithms, and the entire $12 million equity of this corporation were legally transferred into the exact irrevocable trust that your client specifically exempted in his own post-nuptial agreement." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Behind Julian, I heard my sister Jasmine let out a sharp gasp of confusion. My mother Brenda grabbed the wooden railing of the gallery barrier, her knuckles turning white as she tried to process what was happening. Trent simply sat there, staring blankly at the back of Julian's head. Julian gripped the edge of his table, his knuckles shaking violently. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a sudden, terrifying realization. He finally understood what I had done in the dark quiet of my home office while he was drinking champagne and plotting my ruin. He realized that the naive, exhausted wife he thought he had manipulated had actually handed him a loaded gun and watched him point it directly at his own head. He tried to speak, but only a strangled wheezing sound came out of his throat. He looked back up at the judge, his perfect facade crumbling into absolute panic. "Your Honor," he choked out. "Your Honor, she cannot do that. She hid the transfer. She committed fraud." Judge Mercer slammed her hand flat against the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "She did not commit fraud. Mr. Julian," she stated, her voice booming with absolute finality. "She simply signed the legally binding contract that you proudly admitted to drafting yourself. You insulated her trust fund, and she put her empire inside it. The documents are flawless. The transfer was legal, and your own contract forbids you from challenging it." Judge Mercer looked down at the man who had tried to use the law to bleed me dry. Her eyes were devoid of any sympathy. "You overplayed your hand, counselor," she said coldly. "You get nothing." Julian collapsed backward into his heavy wooden chair, all the strength completely vanishing from his legs. The $12 million payday he had promised his mistress, the fortune he had guaranteed my greedy family, the massive payout he thought he had secured, was entirely gone, reduced to nothing but ash by his own signature. But the financial execution was only the beginning, and Elias was already standing up ready to deliver the final lethal blow. Julian's lawyer jumped up from his chair, knocking a heavy legal textbook onto the floor. His voice cracked as he tried to formulate an objection, stammering loudly about hidden documents and unfair surprises. He waved his hands frantically, trying to stop the momentum of the trial, but it was like trying to stop a runaway freight train with a single piece of paper. The courtroom gallery behind us broke into absolute chaos. My mother Brenda let out a loud, dramatic gasp, leaning her body entirely over the wooden barrier. She had come to this courthouse fully expecting to watch me lose everything I had ever worked for, and now the sheer confusion on her face was almost pitiful to witness. Jasmine started frantically whispering to Trent, whose face had suddenly become very slick with sweat. He tugged nervously at the collar of his shirt, looking like a rat that just realized it walked directly into a trap. Judge Mercer picked up her heavy wooden gavel and struck it hard against the sounding block 3 times. The sharp, violent cracks echoed off the marble walls, demanding immediate order in her courtroom. The bailiff stepped forward, placing his hand heavily on his duty belt, and the gallery instantly fell dead silent. The air in the room was so thick with tension, you could practically taste it. Elias did not wait for the lingering echoes to completely settle. He stood tall and buttoned his suit jacket, looking entirely unbothered by the panic erupting across the aisle. "Your Honor," Elias said, his voice cutting through the heavy air like a scythe. "That is unfortunately not all. My client is not simply defending her own assets today. We are also petitioning the court regarding the plaintiff's gross financial misconduct and his deliberate, malicious theft of shared marital funds." Elias picked up a second folder from our defense table. It was much thinner than the brown envelope, but it held a much more destructive payload. He handed copies to the bailiff to pass up to the judge and over to Julian's trembling attorney. "Your Honor, we have submitted official Internal Revenue Service 1099 forms, along with certified wire transfer receipts from the past 6 months. Elias continued pacing slowly in front of the bench. "These documents prove definitively that Julian committed severe dissipation of marital assets while simultaneously planning to file for divorce against my client." Julian tried to sink lower into his leather chair. He looked like he wanted the polished floor to open up and swallow him whole. I sat perfectly still, watching the man who had terrorized me for months finally realize that my silent submission had all been a performance. Judge Mercer reviewed the documents, her lips pressing into a thin, hard line. In family law, there are few things a judge despises more than a spouse who secretly steals from the marital pot to fund an illicit double life. Elias walked out from behind our table and stood in the center of the courtroom, making sure every single person in the gallery could hear him perfectly. He detailed the exact sums of money Julian had stolen from our joint marital accounts over the past half year. He read out the dates and the exact routing numbers for a massive wire transfer of $250,000. That $250,000 was funneled directly into a real estate escrow account, Elias stated, looking right past Julian and locking eyes with my sister Jasmine in the gallery. It was used to purchase a luxury condominium for a woman named Lauren, who is not a party to this marriage, but who is currently residing with the plaintiff. Jasmine gasped loudly, covering her mouth with both hands. Her eyes widened in pure, unadulterated shock. She knew exactly who Lauren was. Her very own best friend was living in a luxury condo funded entirely by the money her brother-in-law stole from her own sister. The betrayal rippled through the gallery like a physical shockwave. My mother Brenda looked completely lost, unable to comprehend that the perfect son-in-law she worshipped was nothing more than a common thief stealing from her own blood to buy real estate for a total stranger. But Elias was nowhere near done stripping them bare. He turned his attention to the second set of wire transfers in the folder. He detailed another $150,000 that had been systematically drained from my business consulting accounts over the span of several months. This money, Elias explained, pointing to the federal tax forms, was sent in structured monthly payments to Apex Strategic Solutions, which is an LLC registered locally as a corporate advisory firm. I heard a heavy thud from the gallery. Trent had slumped back against the hard wooden bench, his breathing suddenly becoming very shallow and rapid. All of his unearned privilege, all of his arrogant swagger, and all of the microaggressions he used to make me feel small, completely evaporated from his body. Elias explained to the judge that this consulting firm provided absolutely no services and had no actual clients other than my husband. It was a fraudulent shell company operated by my brother-in-law Trent. Elias laid out exactly how Julian used Trent's fake business to hide marital funds, shielding the stolen money from the divorce proceedings by illegally writing them off as corporate business expenses. Julian's lawyer looked at the papers in his hands and slowly lowered himself back into his chair, pushing his chair slightly away from Julian. He knew a dead man when he saw one, and he was officially stepping away from the blast radius. A lawyer can defend a cheater, but a smart lawyer will never defend a client who leaves a massive paper trail of federal crimes in open court. Elias walked slowly toward Julian's table. He stopped just a few feet away, looking directly down at the man who had tried to destroy my life and steal my empire. Elias did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The absolute terrifying silence of the courtroom amplified every single syllable he spoke. "Your Honor," Elias said, keeping his eyes locked on Julian's terrified, sweating face. "We conducted a formal legal deposition of the plaintiff exactly 1 month ago. During that sworn deposition, Julian testified under oath that he had absolutely no alternative assets, no hidden portfolios, and no financial interests in any consulting firms. He stated for the legal record that his only income and holdings were listed in his initial disclosure to this court." Julian closed his eyes tightly, a single drop of sweat rolling down his temple and dripping onto his expensive silk tie. He was a corporate lawyer. He knew the exact legal definition of the trap he had just stepped into. His monstrous ego had blinded him to the fact that he was walking into a slaughterhouse of his own making. Since my colleague swore under oath during a formal deposition that he had no alternative assets, Elias said, his voice cold and echoing through the massive room, "this constitutes perjury. Furthermore, these wire transfers and the associated federal tax documents show a clear and undeniable intent of federal tax evasion." The heavy weight of those two words, federal tax evasion, crashed down onto Julian's shoulders like a collapsing building. I sat completely still, watching the exact moment his entire life flashed before his eyes and burned to the ground. He was a corporate attorney. He knew the law better than anyone in that room. He knew that perjury in a family court was one thing, but defrauding the federal government was a death sentence. He was not just losing a divorce case anymore. He was looking down the barrel of immediate disbarment, his law license shredded and revoked forever. He was looking at federal indictments, asset seizures, and years in a minimum security prison. His arrogant posture completely collapsed. His shoulders hunched forward, and he gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned stark white. His breath was coming in short, jagged gasps, as if the air conditioning had suddenly been sucked out of the room. His own defense attorney slowly closed his legal pad and slid his chair a few inches to the right, physically distancing himself from a client who had just become radioactive. No lawyer wants to be standing too close when the FBI comes through the door. The sheer magnitude of the fraud was suffocating. Julian had built a house of cards using my money, my ambition, and my silent endurance as the foundation. He thought he could strip me bare and walk away to a luxury condo with my sister's best friend. He never stopped to consider that the quiet, exhausted woman serving him turkey at Thanksgiving was meticulously documenting every single dirty dollar he funneled out of our marriage. He thought my silence was weakness. He never realized it was focus. The panic was not contained to the defense table. It was spreading like a highly contagious disease into the gallery behind us. I shifted my gaze slightly, catching the reflection of the spectators in the polished wood of the judge's bench. Trent, my arrogant brother-in-law, had turned a sickly shade of grayish-white. All the unearned privilege that he wore like a badge of honor was dissolving right off his skin. He was the one who had strutted into my corporate office demanding a $50,000 consulting fee. He was the one who had sneered at my diversity funding and told me I needed to learn my place. Now he was just a terrified man realizing that the federal government was about to audit his sham business into oblivion. He was going to lose his cars, his house, and his freedom, all because he got greedy and thought he could outsmart a black woman who actually built her wealth from scratch. Trent could not handle the pressure. The reality of the wire transfers, the fake invoices, and the IRS forms sitting on the judge's desk triggered his flight response. He slowly stood up from the wooden bench, trying to be as quiet as possible. He did not look at Jasmine, who was currently weeping softly into her hands. He kept his eyes glued to the heavy double doors at the back of the courtroom. He started inching his way backward, sliding past my mother, stepping carefully toward the exit. He probably thought he could make it to his car drive to his office and start shredding hard drives and burning financial ledgers before the authorities caught wind of the situation. He thought he could just slip away and leave Julian to take the fall. But Judge Rosalind Mercer saw absolutely everything. She did not even look up from the stack of bank statements Elias had provided. She simply reached out, her right hand, picked up her wooden gavel, and slammed it down against the sounding block with a sudden deafening crack. The noise stopped Trent dead in his tracks just 3 feet away from the exit. "Bailiff, ensure no one leaves this courtroom until we adjourn." Judge Mercer commanded, her voice echoing with absolute authority. "I am submitting these documents directly to the district attorney and the Federal Bureau of Investigation." The bailiff, a towering man in a crisp uniform, immediately stepped sideways, blocking the heavy wooden doors. He rested his hand casually on his utility belt, staring Trent down with a look that dared him to take one more step. Trent froze, his eyes darting wildly around the room like a cornered animal. He had nowhere to go. The walls of the courtroom had just become a cage. Defeated and visibly trembling, Trent slowly turned around and walked back down the aisle. His legs seemed to barely support his weight as he sank back onto the hard wooden bench next to his crying wife. He buried his face in his hands, sweating profusely, his breathing rapid and shallow. The consulting mastermind was completely broken, reduced to a shivering mess of a man who finally realized there was no escape from the consequences of his own actions. The silence in the room was absolute devastation. Julian was staring blankly at the floor, his career and his freedom officially over. Jasmine was sobbing, realizing that the luxurious lifestyle she felt so entitled to was entirely funded by stolen money that was about to be seized by the feds. They had absolutely nothing left. They had tried to bury me alive, and instead they had dug a mass grave for themselves and jumped right in. I felt a profound sense of peace settling over my chest. The heavy burden of being the strong black woman, the one who had to carry the financial and emotional weight of these toxic parasites, was finally gone. I did not have to fix this. I did not have to save them. I could just sit back and watch them drown in the flood they had created. But there was one person in the room who absolutely refused to accept the reality of the situation. My mother, Brenda, could not process that her golden son-in-law and her favorite daughter's husband were common criminals. Her brain could not handle the fact that the daughter she had mocked and belittled for years was the one holding the executioner's axe. In her twisted mind, I was still the scapegoat. I was still the one who was supposed to take the blame and keep the family comfortable at all costs. Brenda stood up from the front row of the gallery, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Her face was contorted with a vicious, irrational rage. She completely ignored the rules of the courtroom. She ignored the judge, and she ignored the bailiff. She refused to believe that the men she had placed on a pedestal had brought this ruin upon themselves. She needed someone to blame, and she turned her hatred directly toward me. She pointed a shaking finger right at the back of my head. "You vicious snake!" Brenda screamed, her voice shrill and echoing through the massive room. "You are trying to ruin your family over some money." I did not flinch when my mother screamed at me. The sound of her voice echoing off the high ceiling of the courtroom was a noise I had been conditioned to fear my entire life. Whenever Brenda raised her voice, I was supposed to shrink. I was supposed to apologize and open my wallet to fix whatever crisis my sister had caused. But today the spell was completely broken. Her scream did not sound like authority anymore. It just sounded like desperate panic. I slowly turned around to face the gallery. The courtroom was so quiet that the rustle of my suit jacket seemed loud. Elias stood completely still at the defense table, watching me with a quiet respect. Judge Rosalind Mercer sat back in her high leather chair, making no move to strike her gavel or call for order. She let the silence stretch, allowing the absolute weight of my mother's accusation to hang in the air. I looked at my mother, Brenda. Her face was twisted with a venomous rage, her hands gripping the wooden railing as if she wanted to vault over it and physically attack me. Jasmine was crying softly behind her while Trent kept his head down, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Julian sat frozen at the plaintiff's table, a hollow shell of a man waiting for the federal hammer to drop. They were a perfect portrait of ruined arrogance. I picked up a single sheet of paper from the stack Elias had brought to court. It was the certified copy of the state registry filing the exact document the forensic accountant had highlighted on his screen just hours ago. I held it loosely in my hand and walked deliberately across the polished floor toward the low wooden barrier that separated the gallery from the trial floor. My heels clicked rhythmically, marking the final steps of my subjugation. I stopped right in front of my mother. She glared at me, her chest heaving with indignant fury. She fully expected me to lower my eyes. She expected me to feel the crushing guilt of the strong black woman who had dared to stop carrying her family on her back. "I am not ruining the family, Mom," I said, my voice perfectly steady and calm, carrying clearly across the silent room. "Your golden son-in-law and your favorite daughter did that all by themselves." I held the single sheet of paper out to her. She stared at it as if it were coated in poison, refusing to take it. Her eyes darted from my face to the paper and back again, searching for a trick. "Take it," I told her softly, but with a tone that left no room for argument. "Look at the signature on the bottom line." Brenda's trembling hand slowly reached out and took the document. She adjusted her reading glasses and looked down at the page. I watched her eyes scan the thick black text of the state incorporation filing for Apex Strategic Solutions, LLC. I watched her eyes find the signature line. I saw the exact second she recognized her own looping cursive handwriting resting at the bottom of the page. She looked up at me, her expression shifting from raw anger to a deep, creeping confusion. "This is just the business paperwork Trent asked me to sign," she said, her voice losing its aggressive edge. "He said he needed a local resident to act as a registered agent for his new consulting firm. He said it was just a formality. Julian told me it was perfectly safe, and that it would help Jasmine and Trent get back on their feet. She looked back at Julian, seeking validation, seeking the charming lawyer who had always promised to take care of her. But Julian could not look at her. He stared fixedly at the grain of the wooden table, his jaw clenched tight. He knew exactly what he had done to her. "They lied to you, Mom," I said, letting the cold, hard truth wash over her. "They did not need a local resident. They needed a scapegoat." The confusion on Brenda's face deepened. "What are you talking about, Vivian?" she whispered, gripping the paper tighter. "That company does not do any consulting," I explained, breaking down the criminal enterprise piece by piece so she could fully understand the absolute depth of the betrayal. "It is a fraudulent shell company. Julian has been taking hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal off-the-books kickbacks from his corporate clients. He funneled all that dirty money into the bank accounts attached to the paper you are holding in your hand. Trent washed the money, took a cut to pay for Jasmine's designer lifestyle, and then wired the rest into Julian's hidden offshore accounts." Brenda shook her head slowly in denial. "No," she stammered, looking back at Trent, who was now physically shrinking into the wooden bench, trying to make himself invisible. "No, Julian is a good man. He is a lawyer. He would never do something like that. He said he was protecting us from your greed." "He was protecting himself from the Internal Revenue Service," I corrected her, my voice dropping to a low, chilling pitch. "Julian and Trent are arrogant, but they are not entirely stupid. They knew that if they ran a massive tax evasion scheme, the federal government would eventually catch the scent. They knew that whoever had their name on the primary incorporation documents would be the one held legally responsible for the fraud. They did not want to go to federal prison, Mom. So they put your name on the dotted line." The courtroom remained absolutely motionless. Even the bailiff seemed to be holding his breath, watching a family tear itself apart from the inside out. Brenda's eyes widened in sheer terror as the reality of her situation began to rip through her denial. She looked at the paper again, her breathing becoming erratic. Her beloved son-in-law, the white man who always brought a certain perceived status to our family gatherings, had used her internal racism and her bias to secure his own wealth while leaving her holding the bag. "Trent and Julian put your name as the sole proprietor and managing director to dodge the IRS," I said, delivering the final devastating blow. "You are not just a registered agent, Mom. Legally speaking, you own the entire money laundering operation. You are the sole entity responsible for the corporate taxes on millions of dollars of unreported illegal income." Brenda opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She looked at Jasmine, her favorite daughter, the child she had always protected and elevated above me. Jasmine just sobbed, looking away from her mother, unable to defend the husband who had set her own mother up for a federal indictment. "When the feds come knocking for the $1.2 million in unpaid taxes and penalties," I told her, my voice echoing in the vast room, "you are the one going to federal prison. They used you. They smiled in your face, ate the food at your Thanksgiving table, and legally positioned you to take the maximum sentence so they could live in luxury." The piece of paper slipped from Brenda's, trembling fingers fluttering slowly to the polished floor. The absolute betrayal from the men she had placed on a pedestal shattered her completely. The golden son-in-law she worshipped had handed her a death sentence. The realization hit her physical body like a sledgehammer. Her knees suddenly gave out entirely, and she collapsed downward, hitting the hard wooden bench with a heavy thud. She sat there completely broken, staring blankly into space, as the world she thought she controlled collapsed into dust and ashes around her. Judge Mercer did not offer a single ounce of pity to the shattered people sitting in her courtroom. She picked up her wooden gavel and struck it one final time, announcing that the divorce proceedings were suspended pending a full federal investigation into the financial crimes committed by the plaintiff. "We are adjourned," she stated, her voice ringing with absolute finality. She stood up, her black robes flowing around her, and exited the bench, leaving the wreckage of my family smoldering behind her. Elias calmly packed his legal pads into his battered leather briefcase, snapping the brass locks shut. He looked over at Julian's table where the arrogant corporate lawyer was still sitting frozen, staring at the wall as if his soul had completely left his body. Elias did not gloat. He just nodded to me, signaling that our work in this room was finally done. We walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, pushing open the heavy double doors and stepping out into the wide marble hallway of the courthouse. The air out here was cooler, but the peace only lasted for a fraction of a second. Before the heavy doors could even swing completely shut, they burst open again violently. The illusion of their perfect unified family completely disintegrated the second they crossed the threshold. They did not walk out together. They spilled into the hallway like a pack of starved wolves turning on each other the moment the meat was gone. The polite suburban masks were ripped off, exposing the raw, ugly greed underneath. Trent was the first to explode. The casual, lazy confidence of the white brother-in-law who always thought he was the smartest person in the room was entirely replaced by wild, unhinged panic. He lunged forward, grabbing Julian roughly by the lapels of his custom $3,000 suit and shoved him hard against the cold marble wall of the corridor. "What did you do?" Trent screamed, his face turning a blotchy, violent shade of crimson. His voice echoed down the long hallway, turning the heads of passing lawyers and security guards. "You told me the offshore accounts were untraceable, Julian. You told me you washed the money clean. How did she get the wire receipts, you stupid, arrogant fool? You left a paper trail straight to my business." Julian tried to push Trent's hands away, but he was physically shaking. His polished corporate vocabulary completely failed him. "I did not know," he stammered, his voice cracking in panic. "I did not know she had access to the joint routing numbers. She played me, Trent. She set me up." "You set yourself up!" Trent roared, spittle flying from his lips. "You were so busy buying real estate for your little side piece that you forgot to cover our tracks. The FBI is going to seize everything, Julian. My house, my cars, my bank accounts. I am going to federal prison because you could not keep your hands out of the cookie jar." Standing a few feet away, Jasmine was watching her husband physically assault her brother-in-law. But she was not stepping in to stop them. She was hyperventilating, her hands clutching her designer handbag as she slowly slid down the marble wall until she hit the floor. The reality of her situation was crashing down on her all at once. The golden child who had never worked a hard day in her life suddenly realized she was married to a broke criminal. But the horror ran even deeper than that. She was not just losing Trent. She was losing Julian, too. The man she had been secretly conspiring with. The man who was supposed to secure her a massive payout from my divorce was going to jail. All her safety nets, all her financial sponsors were being locked in a federal cage. She had absolutely no money, no skills, and no future. Her perfect, curated life was a complete and utter fraud. And then there was Brenda. My mother stumbled out of the courtroom doors, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She looked past the screaming match between Trent and Julian. She ignored her favorite daughter, Jasmine, who was currently having a full-blown panic attack on the dirty hallway floor. Brenda did not care about them anymore. The instinct for self-preservation kicked in, and she turned her desperate eyes directly toward the only person who actually had the power and the money to save her. She turned to me. She scrambled across the marble floor, her heels slipping as she practically lunged at me. She reached out and grabbed my forearm, her fingers digging painfully into my suit jacket. All the vitriol and the hatred she had spewed at me just 10 minutes ago had completely vanished, replaced by a sickening, pathetic desperation. Vivian, Brenda sobbed, her face contorted in absolute terror. "Vivian, please, you have to help me. You have to tell your lawyer to fix this. Tell Elias to defend me." I did not know what they were doing. I swear to God, I did not know it was a tax evasion scheme. "You have millions of dollars, Vivian. You can hire the best defense team in the state. You can make this go away." I looked down at her hands gripping my arm. These were the same hands that had pointed at me and called me a vicious snake. These were the same hands that had packed up my living room furniture while I was at work. This was the woman who had stood in a dark pantry and promised to lie under oath to paint me as an abusive wife just so she could get a cut of my stolen wealth. Please, Vivian. Brenda wailed, tears streaming down her face, ruining her expensive makeup. Please, you are my daughter. I am your mother. We are blood. You cannot let them send me to prison. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice. I looked at her with a profound, empty calmness. I reached down and firmly grasped her wrist, peeling her fingers off my jacket one by one. I pushed her hand away, letting it drop to her side. I looked her dead in the eyes, watching the last remaining sliver of hope drain completely out of her soul. You chose your family at Thanksgiving, Brenda, I said, my voice cold and hollow, echoing in the space between us. Enjoy the harvest. I turned my back on her, leaving her standing frozen in the middle of the chaotic hallway. I did not look back at Trent screaming at Julian. I did not look back at Jasmine sobbing on the floor. I simply walked down the long marble corridor with Elias right beside me. The sharp, steady clicking of my heels echoed loudly over the sounds of their screams and their breaking lives. The heavy burden of being the strong black woman was finally gone, left behind in the wreckage of a family I no longer claimed. 6 months is a remarkably short amount of time for an entire bloodline to completely obliterate itself, but greed operates on a highly accelerated timeline. I watched the fallout from a comfortable distance, insulated by the ironclad walls of my irrevocable trust and the quiet protection of my legal team. Elias kept me updated on the mechanical, brutal efficiency of the justice system as it processed the people who used to sit at my Thanksgiving table. The federal government does not care about family dynamics or who was the golden child. They only care about paper trails, and Julian had left a massive glowing map leading right to his own destruction. Julian lost his license to practice law in the state of Georgia in record time. The State Bar Association did not even grant him the dignity of a drawn-out hearing. The moment the transcripts of his perjured deposition and the wire fraud documentation hit the Ethics Committee, he was summarily disbarred. His name was scrubbed from the shiny glass doors of his corporate firm before the ink on the order was even dry. But losing his career was just the prologue to his nightmare. The Department of Justice handed down a federal indictment for perjury, wire fraud, and tax evasion. The luxury condo he had purchased with my stolen money was immediately seized by the feds. Lauren, his beautiful mistress, and my sister's best friend packed her bags the exact day the bank accounts were frozen. She did not stick around to support him through his healing journey when there were no more expensive dinners or designer gifts to keep her comfortable. Julian was left completely alone, facing a decade in a minimum security federal prison with absolutely nothing to show for his brilliant legal mind except a ruined reputation and a public defender. Trent's downfall was even more spectacular because he actually believed his privilege would somehow shield him from the consequences of his actions. The Federal Bureau of Investigation conducted a synchronized raid on both his sham consulting office and his suburban home. They walked out carrying boxes of hard drives, ledgers, and every single physical asset he had purchased with laundered money. They seized his cars, his bank accounts, and his investment portfolios. The arrogant man who had marched into my corporate office demanding a $50,000 consulting fee was reduced to sitting on a curb in handcuffs, watching federal agents repossess his entire fraudulent life. Jasmine, the golden child who had spent her entire adulthood playing the victim and spending money she never earned, finally experienced a crisis she could not manipulate her way out of. When the feds seized Trent's assets, they also froze all of her joint accounts. She found herself standing in an empty house with a husband going to federal prison and a best friend who had abandoned them all. Jasmine immediately filed for divorce, trying to distance herself from Trent's criminal enterprise. But it was entirely too late. Without my financial support, and without Trent's stolen money, she had absolutely no income and zero marketable skills. The woman who used to post passive-aggressive quotes about toxic family members and loyalty was forced to pack a single suitcase and move into a cheap weekly rate motel on the outskirts of the city. She spent her days frantically calling old friends, begging for loans, but the social circles she had cultivated completely turned their backs on her the moment the scandal hit the local news. She was utterly broke, isolated, and entirely forgotten by the people she thought admired her. But the most poetic and devastating justice was reserved for my mother, Brenda. She had happily signed her name as the sole proprietor of a money-laundering shell company, purely because she wanted to secure a massive payout from my ruined marriage. When the Internal Revenue Service came knocking for the $1.2 million in unpaid taxes and penalties, they did not care that she was manipulated by her son-in-law. They only cared that her signature was on the federal documents. Brenda was staring down the barrel of federal prison time. To avoid wearing an orange jumpsuit for the rest of her life, she struck a desperate plea deal with the prosecutors. She agreed to liquidate absolutely everything she owned to pay back the government. The large suburban house where I grew up, the house she prized above all else as a symbol of her status, was put up for auction. The federal agents took her jewelry, her cars, and drained her modest retirement accounts. She was stripped of every single material possession she had used to measure a person's worth. The woman who had sneered at my career and told me I needed to serve my husband a plate of turkey. To be a real woman was forced to move into a tiny, subsidized apartment in a low-income neighborhood. She had no golden son-in-law to pay her bills. She had no favorite daughter to boast about. And she no longer had the strong black woman she had spent 34 years exploiting to bail her out of her misery. They had spent months plotting my absolute ruin. They had sat in dark pantries and expensive restaurants, laughing at my expense, confident that they could use the law to bleed me dry. They thought my silence was submission. They thought my grief was weakness. Instead, I had handed them the rope, and they had eagerly tied the nooses around their own necks. The empire they tried to steal from me was thriving, while their entire world was reduced to ash and federal indictments. They had absolutely nothing left, having destroyed their own lives purely out of greed and arrogance. The crisp morning air of Manhattan hit my face as I stepped out onto the sprawling glass balcony of my new corporate headquarters. The sounds of the city buzzed hundreds of feet below me, a steady, energetic hum of ambition and motion. I rested my hands on the cold metal railing and looked out over the endless concrete skyline. The suffocating humidity of Atlanta and the heavy crushing expectations of my biological family were thousands of miles away, now entirely in the past. I breathed in deeply, feeling a profound sense of lightness in my chest. I was no longer carrying the crushing weight of ungrateful people. The exhausting burden of the strong black woman trope had been permanently severed from my spirit. There was no arrogant husband secretly plotting to steal my life work. There was no golden child sister demanding I fund her lifestyle. There was no manipulative mother demanding my submission to secure her own comfort. There was only the pure, clean air of absolute freedom. I heard the soft slide of the glass door opening behind me. Elias stepped out onto the balcony, holding a steaming cup of black coffee. He stood beside me, looking out at the towering skyscrapers. He did not wear the rumpled suit he used to fool Julian in that deposition room. Today, Elias was wearing a razor-sharp custom suit, fitting for the lead corporate counsel of a company about to make financial history. We did not need to say anything for a long moment. The quiet respect between us was stronger than any biological tie I had ever known. Elias had stood by me when my own blood tried to bury me alive. Inside the massive glass-walled boardroom behind us, my executive team was gathering. They were laughing, sharing pastries, and reviewing the final schedules for the morning. These were the brilliant, loyal minds who had worked 18-hour days alongside me. They were my genuine friends and my chosen family. They saw my value and respected my leadership long before the world knew my name. Today was the culmination of every sleepless night and every silent tear I had ever shed. My fintech application was officially going public. We left the corporate headquarters and rode in a convoy of sleek black vehicles down toward Wall Street. As we pulled up to the iconic building, I looked out the tinted window and saw massive banners draped across the historic columns. They bore the logo of my company, the very same company my mother had dismissed as a little app and my brother-in-law had mocked as a diversity quota handout. The cameras were flashing, and the financial press was swarming the entrance waiting for the black female founder who was about to shatter market expectations. I walked onto the trading floor surrounded by my team. The energy in the room was electric, vibrating with the massive transfer of generational wealth that was about to take place. We stepped up onto the balcony overlooking the sea of traders and digital screens. Elias stood to my right, and my lead developers stood to my left. The countdown began echoing loudly across the trading floor. 10, 9, 8. I placed my hand firmly on the button. I thought about Julian sitting in a prison cell. I thought about Trent losing his cars. I thought about Jasmine in a cheap motel and Brenda sitting in a tiny subsidized apartment. 3, 2, 1. I pressed the button, and the opening bell rang out with a sharp, resonant strike that signaled the start of a new era. The screens behind me instantly lit up with our ticker symbol. The opening stock price flashed in bright green numbers, and within seconds the valuation began to climb higher and higher, entirely shattering the initial projections. The room erupted into thunderous applause. The venture capitalists, the market makers, and my loyal team cheered as the numbers solidified. At that exact moment, my shares in the company vested completely into my personal control. I was no longer just a successful tech founder. I was officially a billionaire. Later that evening, we hosted a private celebration at an exclusive rooftop lounge overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The city lights sparkled like diamonds spread across the dark canvas of the night. I stood near the edge of the terrace holding a tall crystal flute of vintage champagne. I looked down at the golden liquid, watching the tiny bubbles rise to the surface. I realized then what true financial independence actually meant. It was never really about buying expensive clothes or luxury cars or massive penthouses. Money was just a tool. True financial independence was the absolute, unadulterated power to walk away. It was the power to completely remove yourself from toxic environments without leaving a single piece of your soul behind. It was the ultimate power to let greedy, arrogant people burn to ashes in the very same fires they had maliciously started themselves, without feeling a single ounce of guilt or obligation to save them. My family had tried to use the law and their twisted sense of loyalty to bleed me dry. They had tried to turn my marriage, my success, and my own mother against me. But they had severely underestimated the quiet, calculated wrath of a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. They were currently living the miserable consequences of their own betrayals, trapped in the desolate ruins of their arrogance. I raised my glass of champagne slightly, offering a silent toast to the empty night sky. I took a slow, deliberate sip, savoring the crisp, cold taste of the wine. It tasted exactly like the perfect, sweet revenge I had so meticulously built. The nightmare was finally over, and the rest of my beautiful, peaceful life was just beginning. The most profound lesson from this story is that biological ties do not excuse emotional or financial abuse. Society often demands that successful women endlessly carry the heavy burden of ungrateful relatives under the guise of family loyalty. However, true independence is not just about accumulating wealth. It is about acquiring the absolute power to set impenetrable boundaries. You do not owe your hard-earned empire to people who only view you as a disposable resource to exploit. The ultimate victory is realizing you do not have to save toxic people from themselves. Sometimes the bravest and most necessary choice is walking away and letting them face the devastating consequences of their own greed. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace and build your empire, share your story in the comments below. And do not forget to like and subscribe for more empowering journeys of justice and redemption.